Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about clinical trials, an overview for everyone. And it's my pleasure and honor to present today Todd Georgieff. Todd Georgieff has been involved in clinical trials and drug development for over 30 years. A pharmacist by training, he joined the pharmaceutical industry as a study monitor and project manager, and has worked on clinical trials in Canada and globally, and in a number of different capacities. Lately, Todd has been working areas related to innovation and how clinical trials are done, including decentralized trials and the use of digital technologies. A lot of the work he does involves collaborating across many pharmaceutical companies to find the best ways to develop medicines for patients. Todd is also a board director at the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, and his father-in-law, Donald Hemender, died from idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF. So welcome, Todd.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. Excuse me. I'm going to spend some time sort of introducing you to the wonderful world of clinical trials that I've been involved with for the past 3 decades or more. I'm currently still involved in the areas of clinical research, and as Sharon mentioned, I'm currently working in sort of areas of innovation. Later on in the presentation, I'll talk about what those innovative areas are. But today, what I really hope to do is to really sort of familiarize you with the world of clinical trials by talking to you about what a clinical trial is to begin with. I'll set up a little bit of the situation of why we need clinical trials in the first place by outlining how new treatments and new drugs are developed and where clinical trials fit in. And then I'm going to introduce you to some key aspects of clinical trials and some of the terminology that you may hear about clinical trials. I think everybody's heard about placebos, but I'll talk about what a control group is, what blinding or masking is, and why do we randomize clinical trials. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about how trials are supervised and some of the regulations around clinical trials. And I know that one of the concerns that you'll be really curious about is to understand, like, how do we look after the safety of patients in our clinical trials, as well as to make sure that the rights and the privacy of people who might participate in clinical trials are being protected if they choose to participate as well. And then at the end of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how to find a clinical trial, and then what would happen next if you do find a clinical trial to become involved with. That sounds like it might be a good fit. How would you get involved, and what would you expect to happen next? So we've got a fairly long program ahead of us, but what I'll do is I'll try to go relatively quickly, and we'll make sure that we have time for some questions and answers at the end as well. So without further ado, so first of all, what's a clinical trial? And a clinical trial is really set up as like a structured project where we really want to find out whether a treatment or a device or a way of approaching a disease is both safe and effective. Studies can also be conducted to understand how different approaches may work for different people. And the people who participate in clinical trials are always volunteers. Even if you're a patient with a disease, your decision to participate in a clinical trial is always up to you. And we always think that people who are participating in a clinical trial are doing it partly because they're looking for another option to treat their disease, but mostly because they've chosen to do it out of sort of the goodness of their heart and their willingness to contribute to the development of knowledge that may help themselves and may help other patients in the future as well. So study participants, people who participate in studies, they could be patients who have the particular disease that's being studied, or they could also be healthy people volunteers, so volunteers without a disease who want to help to improve medical knowledge. Studies have to follow strict standards. I'll talk about this in a moment. And the standards are all about making sure that study participants are kept safe and that the results are reliable. Those, I would say, are the two biggest obsessions of any clinical trial sponsor, is making sure that the study participants, the people who choose to participate in their studies, are kept safe, and making sure that we're getting all of the safety information that's being recorded in the clinical trial, but also to make sure that we can trust the data and that we can use the information that we collect and feel confident that it's supporting the conclusion that we want to draw from the trial, to make sure that the results that we're recording actually lead us to the conclusions that we draw from the final study report. I'll mention the term sponsor, and all that term sponsor means is that that's the organization or the person who's ultimately responsible for the clinical trial. Most often, when people talk about study sponsors, they're talking about drug companies, biotech companies, or medical device companies. However, sponsors could also be researchers from a university, a particular hospital, or a research organization like the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or the National Cancer Institute, or the Cancer Research Foundation in the UK. They also can be trial sponsors as well. But most often, if I use the word sponsor, just coming from my background, working in a pharmaceutical company for all these years, when I say sponsor, mostly I'm talking about the pharmaceutical company who's running the trial. So clinical trials fall into two big categories. Some, and I alluded to this a moment ago, some of them are called interventional trials. Most of the clinical trials that will be interesting to you are going to be interventional trials. And those are trials that are specifically designed and conducted to figure out how well a particular drug, treatment, or an approach to a disease works. The other kind of clinical trial can be called an observational trial, or sometimes they're called non-interventional trials or patient registries. And what patient registries do, just like the observational title implies, is they really are set up so that we can sort of observe patients in kind of a real world setting and understand how the condition or the disease would progress over time under certain circumstances. And what do I mean by certain circumstances? I mean, maybe we know for a fact that one group follows a particular diet and another group doesn't follow that diet. So let's just study those two groups, both of whom have the disease that I'm interested in, and say, can we draw any conclusions about the effect of that diet on those patients kind of as they live their normal life? Does one patient have a slower progression of the disease than another group of patients who's living under different circumstances? So that's what an observational trial is about. So why do we need clinical trials? So when we develop new treatments or new drugs, and this is really coming from the drug development perspective, the way the process goes is first we have to develop an understanding of the disease. And then quite often, most diseases have some kind of a target that's eventually responsible. So, in the case of pulmonary fibrosis, what's going on in the lungs from like even a biochemical point of view, where that's responsible for setting off the fibrotic processes that are causing your lungs to deteriorate and to develop all of that scar tissue. If I can solve that mystery of what's causing that, then maybe I can find a treatment that hits the target that's responsible for it, and then I can administer the treatment, and maybe, hopefully that will have an effect on whether or not patients will develop or get worse, or maybe I can even cure the condition that I'm talking about. So now what I have to do is to find that treatment that hits that target that's responsible. I want to understand how it works in the lab. Before I give it to a human, I want to understand it in cultures of different cells, like mammal cells. Maybe I'll do some animal studies in different animal species. And really, I want to be pretty sure that I understand not only the treatment effects of the disease, but any toxic effects that treatment effects of the drug on the disease itself, but maybe any toxic effects that I didn't have in mind. Does the molecule that I've developed to hit that target, does it have any unattended side effects as well? And then, so to do that, I'll run toxicology studies. And then I need to figure out how to administer the drug. Does it need to be given as an injection, or can I put it in a pill form or a capsule form and have it taken by mouth? And then eventually I'll have to show that it has the desired effect in humans. And I also have to always keep in mind that any desired effect needs to far outweigh any of the risks or side effects that the treatment might have. Because overall, I want to make sure that my new treatment that I've discovered and I've gone through all of this trouble with, that the benefits are overwhelmingly favorable to any side effects. Because at the end of the day, even one or two bad side effects can well overweigh and make it intolerable and make it very difficult for anybody to receive any of the benefits if they can't tolerate the treatment to begin with. A couple of things to keep in mind. So as we identify what those potential targets are and find potential molecules that might hit those targets, we can find a lot of molecules that maybe hit the target, but then to find the ones among those molecules that are safe and effective in the animal studies, we're going to lose a lot of those different sort of candidates along the way. And then as we run the toxicology studies, we may find that some of those molecules are going to be too toxic that even to go from, a small species in an animal study to a larger species in an animal study, we may already have enough information and say, okay, we're going to stop developing that particular molecule any further. And then when we do the first studies in man, we may have, even fewer molecules that sort of meet the grade and go on to larger and larger clinical trials. And I'll talk about those larger and larger clinical trials. But one of the scenarios that you have to keep in mind is that, if I come home and say, I was given this new medication, and after I took the new medication, I had a headache. I had a terrible headache. Well, you know what? Before I took the medication, I used to get headaches like once every couple of months. I would come down with a severe headache anyways. So how do I know that the headache that I had yesterday after I took that new medication was caused by that medication, and it wasn't something that would have happened anyways? Same thing with drugs to treat pulmonary fibrosis. Some patients are going to have progression of their pulmonary fibrosis, and some patients are going to have their progression hold off for a very long time. But how do you know what progression of the disease, or what difference in the progression of the disease can you attribute to that new drug versus what would have happened anyways? And that's why we need to do the clinical trials, is really to set up that sort of controlled project where we can give the drug to patients and then find out what happens in that clinical trial setting, in kind of a controlled setting, so that we can have a way to compare it to. And I'll talk a little bit about those comparison groups as well. So what we normally do is we'll give that fancy new molecule that's been through all of that pre-development stuff. We know that it's safe. We know it seems to hit the target. And then we'll also give to another group a control treatment. I'll define that for you in a moment. And really see, what kind of things happen in both groups, and do we see a higher incidence of either the good news side effects, or the good news effects, or the bad news side effects in those two groups as they run through the clinical trial itself. So that's why we need clinical trials, is really to be able to have a systematic way of understanding what's going to happen in the normal course of time to that particular group of patients, and what both good news and bad news effects of the product can we most likely attribute to the treatment itself, and not something that would have happened because of the disease or because of just like real life and things that happen to patients anyways. So I started to talk about this a little bit. So, normally we talk about drug trials being in 4 different phases. I mean, to skip to the punchline, most of the clinical trials that you're going to hear about and find as a patient are going to be phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, particularly phase 3 clinical trials. And there's a reason that most of the clinical trials that you'll come across are going to be phase 3 clinical trials. It's because we do more of those. And you'll understand why we do more of those in a moment. So phase 1 clinical trials are really meant to be sort of the first time we give a new molecule to humans. And what we're really trying to do is to find out, is it safe? And are there any sort of top-level side effects that we need to know about? And can we demonstrate that the product is actually getting into the body? Are we able to administer the product safely and have it absorbed by the body, or administer it without any sort of terrible side effects? Phase 2 is where we put in a slightly larger group of patients, usually patients with the disease, and we want to at this point assess whether or not we're seeing any treatment effect. Does it actually seem to be having the effect on that target? And are we actually able to observe an effect on the disease itself? And those tend to be sort of smaller sized trials. So a phase 2 trial might be 50 or 100 patients or a couple hundred patients. In the phase 3 clinical trials, so if everything looks good in the phase 2 clinical trials, then what we'll do is we'll go into phase 3 clinical trials, which we call the confirmatory clinical trials. And that's where the clinical trials tend to get much bigger. Here, we're quite often talking about several hundred, or sometimes even several thousand patients. And the difference between, whether we need a couple of hundred patients or a couple of thousand patients is really what is the size of the treatment effect or the risk of the side effects that we're expecting to see. Because if I have a side effect that only happens, 1 in 100 patients, and I only give it to 100 patients, then I may not have enough patients to actually observe that side effect. And it may need to work, what we don't want to do is wait until the drug is freely available on the market and find out only at that point that 1% of patients have some unfortunate side effect. So the phase 3 clinical trials tend to be larger so that we can both observe any subtle differences, any subtle benefits, but also so that we can observe any side effects, including side effects that may only happen on a very infrequent basis as well. And then sometimes after a product reaches the market, we'll conduct what are called phase 4 trials or post-marketing trials. Excuse me. And the idea there is to understand a little bit better, how does our new treatment work and how does it show up when it's being used in real life, and kind of like at the level of the population of who has the disease. So, whereas I may have had, a few hundred to a couple of thousand patients globally in the phase 3 clinical trials, now I may have tens of thousands of patients who I'm quite often observing in the phase 4 clinical trials to really understand, if we saw those rare side effects, how rare are they really? Are we really seeing those side effects reproducing or showing up in real life now that the product is on the market? Or is it showing up to be as rare as we had hoped it was going to be? And the same thing with what do the real life treatment effects look like as well? As I kind of described when I was talking about why we need clinical trials, in order to detect the differences between the treated group and that control group in the clinical trial, usually we have to control the circumstances pretty well. But now that the drug has been approved and it's on the market, I may be able to be less selective about the patients who are enrolled in the post-marketing trials. So I'll get a better sense of what happens when sort of all patients can receive the treatment as well. So that's why we do phase 4 clinical trials. And sometimes the Health Canada or the FDA or other international health authorities, they ask us to do phase 4 clinical trials so that we can have a more complete understanding of how safe and effective those treatments are in real life. Okay, so I've mentioned some of these terms before. I've talked about placebos and I've talked about control treatments. And most people know what a placebo is. We always call those like sugar pills. And the idea is that the placebo is something that looks identical to the treatment, but it doesn't contain any of the active ingredient that we're talking about, or a placebo by definition doesn't contain any active ingredient at all. And it's really just kind of going through the motions and giving patients like a dummy treatment. What we do more often in the industry these days is provide control treatments. And what that means is maybe it's the standard of care. So for example, if everybody in the world treats their headaches with aspirin, and I have something that I think might work better than aspirin, then what I have to do is show that my new improved headache treatment is better than aspirin. So I may have one large group that gets the aspirin and one large group that gets my new fancy headache treatment. And that's what a control treatment is. The control treatment is that standard of care, the aspirin, to find out when I'm looking at my new treatment, is it showing up much better? Is the treatment effect much better, an enhanced treatment effect? And also, do I see a higher or lower rate of side effects on that new treatment compared to that control treatment? So it's really just something to compare it to give you a basis of comparison, to have an idea of what volume of the good effects or of the bad effects can I attribute to the new treatment compared to what would have happened otherwise if they weren't given that treatment. Sometimes, even in serious diseases like pulmonary fibrosis, sometimes we still use placebos. Where we use placebos is that if there is no standard of treatment, no standard treatment that exists, and if there is no reason to believe that the new treatment is going to have some kind of a dramatic treatment effect, we certainly hope it does. But if there's really no reason to think that it's going to have a treatment effect, or that the safety of the product is going to be any better than nothing at all, those are the situations where we would use a placebo, is really so that we can control all of the other aspects of the treatment, but really have no kind of noise to compare it to. When the first studies of Esbriet and OFEV were done, we certainly did have placebo-controlled trials even shortly before those drugs were approved, because there really was nothing else for pulmonary fibrosis at the time. So we really had no choice but to have some patients in the placebo group and some patients receiving the active OFEV or Esbriet as well. So the next concept that I wanted to go through is masking or blinding. And really what blinding or masking are about is really about sort of controlling for bias. When we give a brand new medication to an investigator to give to their patients, we wouldn't be doing it if we weren't excited and very, very optimistic that that new treatment was going to have a beneficial effect. We want to believe, the sponsor wants to believe that it's going to have a beneficial effect. The investigator wants to believe that it's going to have a beneficial effect. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to go into the clinical trial thinking that, oh, I'm going to hope for the best here. I'm going to hope to see the best, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to influence the assessments that the doctors are making and giving us the benefit of the doubt and maybe pushing the new treatment over the line and sort of giving it a more positive light than the control treatment or the placebo. So the idea of blinding or masking is to make sure that nobody who's responsible for assessing, for observing the treatment effects in patients gets to know during the trial who's getting what drug, who's getting the placebo or the control group, and who's getting the active. What we do in practice is that everybody goes through the clinical trial, and then only at the very, very end of the clinical trial do we open up the secret code and find out who got what. And we only do that just before we analyze the very final results of the clinical trial. And then finally, another concept that happens in just about every clinical trial that I've ever heard of is something called randomization. And what randomization means is really making sure that there's no way to predict, or more importantly, to influence which patients get assigned to which treatment group. Because that could play out a couple of ways to say, well, I've got really high hopes for this new medication, so I want to make sure that my sickest patients absolutely have the new medication, and that the patients who don't need it as badly, it's okay if they get the control group or the standard of care or the placebo. Well, that could work two ways. One is maybe I'll see a larger than anticipated treatment effect, or maybe I'm putting that new treatment at a disadvantage by putting the sickest patients at that new treatment, and maybe they'll have more side effects than the healthier patients. So what randomization does is it says that there's no way of predicting or influencing, so that hopefully patients with all different severities and all different sort of genetic makeup get equally assigned to those two groups, to the active treatment group and the control group or the placebo groups, so that at the end of the day, any differences I see in the outcomes in those two groups, I can say it's because of the treatment. That's what I'm seeing is the effect of the treatment. And I'm not seeing sort of the outcome of a bias because I stacked the deck in favor of one of the treatments or the placebo, for example. So that's what randomization is about, is really make both randomization and blinding, they're all about controlling for bias to make sure that the results in the clinical trial are as unbiased as possible by sort of leveling the playing field and making sure that that we don't have any influence for either who gets assigned or how the outcomes are assessed during the clinical trial. Okay, this is another wordy slide, and I apologize for the wordy slides. Informed consent. So one of the things I mentioned before, that one of the big things that's on the top of our mind all of the time when we run clinical trials is making sure that the patients in trials are treated with the utmost of respect. And because we think that your participation in a clinical trial needs to be entirely voluntary, it needs to be your decision. If it's your decision, you really need all the information about what it is you're signing up for. And that's where informed consent comes in. And informed consent is really about making sure that the people who choose to participate in a research study or a clinical trial, that they're aware of all of the things that participation would involve. And that includes, yes, potential benefits, but also any of the risks, any side effects that we might anticipate happening. It should also outline the time commitment. We should also talk about how your personal information and private information and measurements are going to be handled and protected from being inappropriately disclosed. Usually informed consent is documented in writing. So there'll be like a form to sign. The form will contain all of that sort of background information about the risks and benefits and commitments, etc. And at the end, we'll ask you to sign on the bottom of the form. And it should emphasize also that participation is voluntary, entirely voluntary, and that once you're in the clinical trial, you can usually change your mind and withdraw from withdraw from consent. The only reason I say usually is that if you're taking part in a study that has to do with like a surgical intervention, for example, we're going to do surgery or a lung transplant, and you go through the transplant and then you decide to withdraw your consent, well, we can't undo the transplant. We can't undo the operation, but you can certainly still decide to be withdrawn from any of the long-term follow-up, as long as you know the consequences of having done that, which is really, there will be no consequences or retribution to you for having withdrawn. It's just sort of, there's a potential that you'll be followed less closely than you would have been followed if you were still in the clinical trial.
Excuse me, Todd, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So I want to know, is it possible for them to request someone to review, the consent form, because they feel that it's really overwhelming? There's a lot of stuff in there that they don't understand. Is it ever possible, like if you're going to be involved in one of these things, to have somebody go through it with you, review it in sort of lay terms?
Yes, not only is it possible, it's kind of desirable as well. And as a representative of a trial sponsor, I would kind of expect that would be part of the investigator's responsibility, or the study nurse should, at a minimum, should give you an outline, provide the consent form to you, give you time to read it. At a minimum, they should be able to answer any questions that you have about it. And I've seen many centers or many investigators or doctors who do clinical trials. Well, what they'll do is they'll go through the informed consent form with their patient page by page to make sure that everything that they're signing up for is well understood. And not surprisingly, the patients who get seen by those kinds of doctors feel much more confident that we're on their side. that they're being looked out for, and that we really want to make sure that they are comfortable with their understanding of everything that's involved with the clinical trial. I think the other point that I'd like to emphasize is that far too often, and this is a conversation that sponsors have internally from time to time as well, we confuse the idea of consent with the idea of getting somebody's signature on a form. Informed consent is not about the idea of getting somebody's signature on a form. Informed consent is really about that top line on my slide here, which is really sort of making sure that you have a good understanding of what your participation in the study requires of you, what kind of risks you're signed up for, and making sure that those risks are being well regarded and kept top of mind the whole time, not just when you're signing the form, but after you sign the form and until you're done with the clinical trial as well. And it also emphasizes that fourth bullet as well, which is, because the idea of informed consent and maintaining informed consent is kind of like an ongoing concept, if you will. Like, the fact that you haven't withdrawn tells me that you're still consenting to stay participating in the trial. There may be times where new information becomes available. You might be patient number 100 in the clinical trial, and you know what? We saw something in the first 50 patients, and we should really update our information about the kind of risks that we're anticipating based on what we've already seen. So there may be a time in the clinical trial where a patient is asked to sign an updated consent form that might have new safety information in it. And that's really sort of consistent with what you're asking about as well, is to say, let's make sure that patients always have the most up-to-date information, and make sure that they are still good to go and still have a good understanding of what they're involved with and what their options are if they, indeed choose to change their mind. Thanks for the question. That's a really good question.
Thank you.
And then that second bullet point about the privacy of your information, this is a really important concept that I want to make sure that I spend a couple of moments on as well, which is when you go to a clinic and get signed up for a clinical trial, Just like if you were not signed up for a clinical trial, you'll be sharing lots of personal information and health information with your doctor and with the doctors, nurses, and his staff. And they're going to write that information in your health records. And some of that information is going to be personally identifiable. It'll have your name, your address, your social insurance number, etc., your health card number. And all of that information is kind of between you and the doctor in the clinic or the hospital. When sponsors are running clinical trials, I think I'll say this on the next trial, sponsors have to monitor the clinical trial just to make sure that all of the information that all of the measurements and things that we're collecting in the course of the clinical trial are verifiable and that we can trust them. We'll collect sort of the test results, the results of the breathing test and the results of the x-rays, but we will never collect anything that's personally identifiable. And it's something that we're very aware of. We don't, we might know that a patient with the particular initials were seen at a particular hospital for this clinical trial, but we won't collect any information that would be able to connect us back to you personally. And that should be universally true. And it's one of the things that we always look out for and we're super sensitive about, because we have the utmost respect. And at the end of the day, it's not about the identity of the people that participated in the clinical trial. It's about those test results, the x-ray results, the breathing test results, the safety assessments, and those kinds of things. So we'll collect like the results information, but we won't collect the information about you. We'll take some information about your age and your gender, and maybe some of the background conditions you might have, but none of that information should be connectable back to your sort of name, address, your personal identity. That's something that we would never want to collect. We're very sensitive about that as well. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about how clinical trials are supervised. So Health Canada, like the Food and Drugs Administration in the United States and like the European Medicines Agency in Europe, we have very strict guidelines. In Canada, it's called the Food and Drugs Act and Regulations. Then there are also a set of international standards called Good Clinical Practices. What the regulations and good clinical practices all stand for are the bits that are down below, which is really to make sure that the products that we are using, that we are justified in using them, and also making sure that all kinds of adequate controls are in place to make sure that patients are kept safe, that patients all have to sign informed consent form. We also have a responsibility to sort of monitor the clinical trial. And by monitoring the clinical trial, what that means is that we actually will send people to look, either, in the good old days when I started doing this work, I used to like physically, get in my car or get on a plane and go and visit the doctor who is running the clinical trials and look at the records to make sure that they're following the procedures that the clinical trial requires, that they're recording all of the information and all of those measurements accurately, and making sure that the consent forms are properly signed and dated, and making sure that there's good evidence that the patients who are in the clinical trial at that particular clinic are being kept safe and being well looked after. And then finally, there are bodies around the world called ethics committees, and the ethics committees have to review all of the information about the study as well as the study itself. So I'll just spend a moment and talk about what an ethics committee is. It's a group of people or a committee that includes both medical and scientific experts. They usually have an expert on medical ethics, legal expert, and then some kind of a lay person or a patient representative, who could be a patient, a parent, or a patient advocate, for example, who's really taking sort of the patient's perspective in reviewing this and making sure that they can speak to it and understand what it is we're proposing to do in that clinical trial and why that might be acceptable. So what they do is they make sure that the research is based on good scientific principles, that the project is properly set up, and that it's going to has a good chance of meeting its desired outcomes. They also make sure that the safety and the rights of the people who choose to participate are well protected, and that means the privacy measures, that means the safety measures, means making sure that the study visits are going to occur often enough. And then finally, and very importantly, they also review all of the different materials that are going to be handed to patients that explain the clinical trials, and they review them to make sure that they are complete and understandable, and make sure that there are adequate measures in place to protect the privacy of that patient information, of that identifiable patient information as well. So every clinical trial in Canada and around the world has to be reviewed by an ethics committee. And just like I was saying about informed consent, ethics committee approval is an ongoing thing. If the trial goes on for more than 1 year, we have to submit an update to the ethics committee to report on progress and to keep them up to date on any safety findings that we may have during the clinical trial as well. We're coming to the end. And I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things I'm involved with, one of the areas I'm involved with, is all kinds of innovative areas in clinical trials. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. The first sort of trend that's happening in the industry now is something called patient-focused clinical trials. And what that implies is kind of two different things. The one that's explained in this slide is really sort of designing clinical trials so that the kinds of information we're collecting are the kinds of things that patients mention most often when they talk about their disease. So as a patient who's suffering from a particular disease, you may be more concerned about how it affects your ability to conduct your activities of living, like, how easy is it to do your laundry and walk up and down the stairs of your house, or to walk around the block with your children or your grandchildren. Whereas to run the clinical trials, the health authorities may say, well, in order to approve this drug for pulmonary fibrosis, what I really need to see is the results of a very accurate CT scan or a chest X-ray that's showing a certain kind of, like photographic abnormality on the X-ray scan. And at a certain point, you go, well, I want to make sure that my X-rays aren't abnormal, but at the end of the day, I care more about walking around the block with my grandchildren than about whether or not there's a particular kind of like abnormality on my X-ray. And what patient-focused trials are is really looking more at those more meaningful outcomes and endpoints that are more meaningful and more impactful to patients' lives than looking at those sort of more scientific measures of the disease that might be based on sort of lab tests and imaging and those kinds of things as well. They're both important, but which one you emphasize says a lot for sort of how do we build clinical trials that are going to have the biggest impact on build clinical trials and also develop medicines that are more could have a more significant impact on patients' lives. The second way that the patient-focused trials are, or that phrase is used, is really thinking about building the trial around the patient rather than building a trial and hoping that patients will come. And a couple of concepts that speak to that are the idea of decentralized trials. Now, one of the problems with clinical trials, particularly clinical trials for a rarer disease like pulmonary fibrosis, is that, as I said, we may need a few hundred patients to run a phase 3 clinical trial in those kinds of diseases, but we only need a few hundred patients. And if those few hundred patients end up getting spread across the world, then the number of sites within any particular country like Canada that get involved with those clinical trials is going to become smaller and smaller. Odds are those clinical trials are going to be placed in very busy centers, very, very busy clinics that see a lot of pulmonary fibrosis patients so that we can enroll those trials quickly. Quite often then, that means there's fewer opportunities to participate in those clinical trials, and the opportunities that there are go to people who live close to those big centers in urban areas like major cities, for example. That's not fair in a couple of ways. What the idea of decentralized trials involves is saying, rather than making every patient come to the clinical trial clinic for every single visit, what we want to do is we want to make it possible so that some of those visits or some of those evaluations can be done much closer to the patient's location. So, for example, can I do a breathing test that's somewhere down the road from you, even if you don't live in downtown major city? Can we do the blood sampling at a local laboratory rather than making you to come all the way to the big teaching hospital in order to get your blood sample collected? Can we even have the chest X-ray or the CT scan done somewhere closer to home? Or could we even send you like a mobile unit to do that, either in your own bedroom or your own living room or in your driveway in some cases? So the idea of doing decentralized trials, the concept of hybrid trials is a brand new concept, which means that yes, some of the visits may still be at the hospital center, but maybe a lot of the visits are actually going to be done in the patient's home or near the patient's home, so that it's not purely, a hospital-driven study where everybody has to come to the hospital for every visit, and it's not purely a decentralized study where we can do everything remotely, but there might be a mixture of visits where some of them are done. Yes, you may still have to come to the hospital once or twice a year, but the in-between visits may happen closer to home and make it much more possible for us to include patients from all over the country and not just from major centers. So that's something that the industry has been working on. And I'm sure you can imagine that with COVID over the past couple of years, although we've been talking about doing decentralized trials for many years in the industry, the past couple of years with COVID and patients' inability to come into hospitals, either for infection control measures or because of their own risk, not wanting to expose people to their own risks, the industry has done a very good job of finally figuring out how to do more decentralized and home-based clinical trial visits as well. And then the last sort of innovative area, which, it's almost tragic for us to say that this is innovative, is the idea of diversity and inclusion. I mentioned to you that one of the main reason that we want to do clinical trials is to understand how is this medication going to work in a real patient population that has the real disease in the real world. Well, one of the considerations is to make sure that the makeup of the patients who participate in our clinical trials, meaning their gender, their race, their age, their demographics, and their looks like the final patient population that's going to prescribe that treatment. And if in the clinical trials, I only end up recruiting, white middle-aged Caucasians, Caucasian males, then how can I be sure that I'm going to see the same kind of treatment effects and the same kind of safety profile when it's being given to patients of all different ethnicities and all different races and all different ages out in the real world? So making sure that we're designing clinical trials that are open to everybody and placing them in centers that have a better capability, I guess, of enrolling diverse populations, that's become a very big topic in the industry right now. And also making sure that we are not biasing the design of our clinical trials, even with things like making sure that the study visits that we're asking patients to go through are not overly burdensome and too lengthy. Because that if, for example, if you're an hourly worker, you may not be able to take time off work for half a day to go to the clinical trial, to go to your clinical trial center in the major city, or even more than half a day, maybe a day or two that you need to take out every couple of months. And that may inadvertently bias that clinical trial against some patients from different socioeconomic backgrounds or different race groups and those kinds of things as well. So we're doing our very best in the industry now to try to move away and to make our clinical trials as inclusive as possible, so that the populations who participate in those clinical trials can look as much as possible like the populations who are eventually going to receive the medications when they're approved.
Sorry,
Yes.
just wanted to ask you, there's a question here. So you're talking about diversity and inclusion. So would you say that the COVID vaccination trials were reflective of this because it was happening around the globe and it's been given to almost every single person on this planet?
It's a two-part answer. I would say, and actually the companies who sponsored those trials, they drew some attention early on, because just like I was describing for other clinical trials, the patients who participated in the early trials tended to be more Caucasian, more urban, more, in like higher income brackets and those kinds of things. So they've course corrected, and now they've been much more intentional about including diverse populations after the first round of trials. So I would say all of the trials, the trials for the subsequent like vaccine strains, the subsequent virus strains in the vaccines, they tended to be more diverse. The other thing to keep in mind is that whole thing about those phase 4 studies, these sort of post-marketing trials that we do as well. Now, not only do we have those clinical trials that the vaccines were approved on, but now we have a lot, like, literally billions of patients worth of real world data about what happens in the real world population to patients, including a diverse patient population who have received those vaccines now that they've been, on the market for 2 or 3 years as well.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question. So now I'm going to my last couple of slides are about how to find clinical trials. The thing to keep in mind is that participating in a clinical trial is a big decision. You should certainly speak to your respirologist, your primary pulmonary fibrosis doctor, your family doctor, or your ILD nurse if you have one. As I mentioned before, trials for pulmonary fibrosis, they tend to be placed at busy respirology clinics, and that's really so that we can get those hundreds of patients as quickly as we can. Unfortunately, that means that if you don't live in a major city, that it becomes that much more difficult to find the clinical trial unless you're able to travel. Although, like I said, we're doing our best to try to make that travel requirement less and less over time. But I would say currently, it's still a big issue for most clinical trials, and most clinical trials are not doing a very good job in reaching out into sort of major center area kind of locations. Online resources, I've just listed a few there. So on the CPFF website, you'll find a bit of a clinical trials directory. We're going to be building that out over time. It's not very well developed yet. We know it's not very well developed yet, but we're going to be working on that over the next year or so. If you wanted to look for clinical trials in the US, the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation in the US actually has a trial finder and a trial matching platform. That's a little screenshot of it there on the left-hand side of the slide, where you can put in some of your own high-level information, including your location in the US, and find a clinical trial that might suit you. There would still be some legwork left to do after you found that clinical trial, but you may find a clinical trial where, at least at a high level, you'd be able to find out, is it recruiting patients with my kind of pulmonary fibrosis? What if I have some other kinds of background diseases? What if I'm not in the right age bracket? Those kinds of things as well. So those are the kinds of criteria that you put into their matching tool, and then it will read back to you a list of potential clinical trials that you might match for. Unfortunately, it's really focused on the US at the moment, but that's the kind of thing that we're working on. No promises, but it's the kind of thing that we're investigating whether we could implement that here in Canada.
So Todd, sorry to interrupt. Someone wanted to know, once you find a clinical trial and you contact them to get onto the clinical trial, but they tell you, sorry, you're not a good candidate. Like, how do they determine that? How come they couldn't get on? Why couldn't they qualify?
Yeah, it's really that. I mean, that it's kind of like you were saying about the informed consent form. You should be A patient should be able to find out why they didn't qualify, like what specifically is it. Now, I'll admit, certainly because of the need to control the circumstances of a clinical trial, we tend to be pretty selective because we need to make sure that those different groups that are put into the clinical trial, like the active group and the treatment group, they need to resemble each other as closely as possible. So we tend to put together a lot of selection criteria that says we want patients that look like this but not like that, or we want patients with this problem but not those problems. So there tend to be very long lists of we actually call them inclusion and exclusion criteria that have to be met. So there's a long checklist. Now, my expectation would be that if there's one or more of those eligibility criteria that you don't meet, that a particular person doesn't meet those criteria, they should be explained which ones were the deal breakers, which ones were the ones where they were outside of what they were looking for. The other thing to keep in mind is that because we're trying to isolate the effects of the drug and what we observe, that quite often any patients with significant other diseases or comorbidities, they tend to be excluded from clinical trials, which is neither fair nor, probably a good idea in the long run. But particularly for the earlier phase clinical trials, we tend to be more selective. So if you have a lot of other health problems, then likely, in all likelihood, it may be more difficult for you to find a clinical trial. However, for some of the phase 3 and phase 4 clinical trials, we tend to be more open to it as well. And then the last consideration is some patients are judged to be unsuitable just because the investigator knows that the burden of the clinical trial is going to be too much. It's going to be too much for the patient or their family or their own personal circumstances. That if I have a clinical trial that means you have to be at the center for, a day a month, or, sometimes even more frequent than that, you need to spend, hours here every week or two. And I know your personal circumstances may not lend themselves to that, then the message you may get back is this isn't right for you. So there's a long checklist from concurrent medical problems to sort of personal burden and personal challenges to some of the more detailed checklisty things that patients may or may not qualify for. But at the end of the day, it's definitely worth asking, what specifically is it that disqualified me from this trial as well?
Okay, thank you. Because as someone who's participated as being the patient advocate on the clinical trials to give feedback from patients and their concerns, one of the things that I've heard from many patients to say that even when they qualify, they sort of decide not to because it's a long-term commitment, and
Yeah.
often it involves their caregiver as well. And so really you're not getting just the one person, you're getting two people because someone has to drive them to the appointment, someone has to help them keep track. And oftentimes it's like a 2 hour drive to there, another 2 hours at the clinic, and another 2 hours to come back. So you're looking at a whole day.
Yeah.
And people are always concerned that, they might be able to do it, but will the person who's going to be providing them support, could they do it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other consideration that I was just thinking about was that, and this is particularly true of pulmonary fibrosis, so far, unfortunately, most of the medications that we have available are in development for pulmonary fibrosis. Most of them, what they do is they will sort of stabilize your disease. They'll, greatly slow down how quickly your disease progresses and gets worse. So therefore, we tend to favor patients who are earlier in the course of their disease, who are sort of in better condition to start with, so that we can keep them better for longer and longer, because it sort of increases our chances of seeing a treatment effect, versus somebody who's well along in the course of the disease. Just that particular clinical trial may have had a more mild patient in mind as well. So there's all kinds of these things that you really need to sort of pick apart and understand, like, what exactly was this clinical trial looking for, and how can I have a better chance next time?
Thank you.
So then my last couple of slides, this clinicaltrials.gov site is an interesting one to look at. This is a trick to use. It's taken me a while to learn how to use it. I've got a couple of slides in here that you'll be able to see offline as well. But really, it is not straightforward. The industry understands the industry, and this is actually something that's run by the National Library of Medicine through the National Institutes of Health in the US. And basically every clinical trial that's going on in North America, and it tends to be every clinical trial that's going on in the world, it has to be disclosed on this clinicaltrials.gov website. So if there's a clinical trial, it'll be here. Excuse me. Finding clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, though, it does require some skill and some practice. So when you sign on to clinicaltrials.gov, the first screen you'll see is this one with like 4 blanks and a search button. The first thing I would suggest you do is choose this button here. Well, these orange labels I added, they're not on the website. So I added these to highlight them. So choose the recruiting and not yet recruiting studies. So those are studies that are in planning. And then click right away to the advanced search button here at the bottom. So number 1, choose recruiting. Number 2, choose the advanced search button. Then you'll get to something like this. And then, of course, at the top of the page, you'll put in pulmonary fibrosis. And you'll see as you start typing pulmonary fibrosis, it'll predict that that's what you're after. You probably want to find interventional studies. If you're interested in observational studies, that's another thing that you'll find in the drop-down list as well. And then verify that you've picked the studies that are not yet recruiting or recruiting. And then down below on this page, you'll find sort of more of these buttons, and one of those buttons includes the country that you live in as well. So you'll be able to pick countries where they have pick countries to make sure that you're seeing clinical trials that are at least listed as participating in that country. And then what you'll get is you'll get a long list of clinical trials that should be going on in your country for your disease. That's where the work starts. Is that once you've done that, sometimes you probably need to bring that list either to your doctor or follow up and figure out, okay, how do I figure out where exactly these trials are? You probably won't get hundreds of trials going on in your country, but sometimes it is a bit of work to find the recruiting trials that are going on in your country as well. So as I mentioned, that we know that this website is difficult to use, and there is an update that's going to be released later this year that's supposed to make it much more friendly for patients and caregivers to be able to navigate and get more meaningful results from. So then what? And I think this is actually my last slide. So you found a possible trial. So now what? Some of those trials may have contact numbers to assist you. I know what some sponsors do is they'll have like a 1-800 number. If you found a clinical trial that sponsor has, or that particular pharma company is sponsoring, they'll have a 1-800 number, and you'll be able to call and find out, like, is anybody doing this trial close to me? So if there is that kind of central number, it's definitely worth calling that number to find out, is there anybody nearby in my province, in my city, in my state? Next thing, obviously, is you really do need to speak to your respirologist, your primary pulmonary fibrosis doctor, your family doctor, or your ILD nurse. They may be able to help you find the clinic. They will certainly be able to help you decide whether or not the trial is right for you, so you can anticipate, are you indeed a fit, or is there something you're missing? Is there something about your disease that may not make you the best candidate for the trial? Or even more likely, is there something about the trial where they might be looking for somebody that's a little bit different from your particular makeup as well? The bottom line is, are you likely to qualify for the study? And then understanding what the time commitment looks like, because of this need for sort of inpatient in-clinic visits, as opposed to our inability to bring a lot of these trials to patients in a decentralized kind of a trials way. Sometimes the time commitment can be significant, and it may be very difficult for you to participate. And then, of course, discuss it with your family, the people who are helping take care of you, your caregivers, and your family doctor. And remember that study participation is your choice, and ask questions. Coming back to Sharon's first question about informed consent, sort of the end of this process is the informed consent process. The end of finding a trial is being presented with that informed consent form. But the informed consent process is there for you to understand, like, what exactly is involved, what does my participation require from me, and what are the risks and what are the potential benefits. And remember, it's really meant to be a process to not only inform you at the start, but to keep you informed throughout your participation in the trial, to make sure that you're still good to be involved in that clinical trial and to be committed to it. So that is my last content slide. This slide is really just a repeat of the first slide that I showed you. And now we have time for a couple more questions if there are any.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I want to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A section and we'll be able to see it. So first of all, someone wanted to know, how expensive are these clinical trials?
Very, very expensive. So drug trials or clinical trials tend to be very expensive, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, I mentioned all of the regulatory requirements and the need to monitor the trials. So the drug company sponsored, not only drug company, but also academic sponsors, they need to have, people in place to set up the clinical trials properly, to set up the data collection, set up the computer systems. And they also need people to go out and monitor those clinical trials regularly during the course of the clinical trials. When a physician does a clinical trial, the time that they're spending collecting all of that data and spending, sometimes an hour or more, going through that informed consent form, and maybe several hours with the study monitors, or several hours doing all of the administrative stuff, that's time that they're not able to see patients and they're not able to be in their clinics. So because it's so time consuming and such a commitment to get doctors to participate in clinical trials, we pay doctors to do those clinical trials. We have to compensate them for the time and the time of their staff to do those clinical trials. And if you multiply all of those payments, not only for the monitors and the doctors and the clinics and the nurses times the hundreds or thousands of patients that may be involved in a clinical trial, it adds up pretty fast. So an average clinical trial these days, there is no such thing as an average, but a clinical trial, it's been a long time since I saw a clinical trial budget that was less than, several $1 million. And I've seen them go up to, literally hundreds of millions of dollars for one clinical trial. And that's really because of those complications, and also because of that multiplier effect, the fact that all of these things that we have to do them thinking about, hundreds or even many thousands of patients who would be involved in the clinical trial, and it needs to be quite a big machine that's capable of mobilizing for that kind of an effort.
Thank you. Another person wanted to ask, they're on a clinical trial, they're halfway through, but they're very frustrated because they don't seem to get informed, like, how's it doing? A lot of people feeling better. Like, how can, they go and ask, like, how's the clinical trial going?
Yeah, that's a tough one because there's a lot of layers in the answer to that question. So part of it has to do with the blinding of the clinical trial. So for example, the fact that, intentionally we try to make sure that the sites that are participating in a clinical trial, that they're protected from any of the information about how things are going, because we don't want to bias them one way or another. To be able to say, oh, it's great, we're seeing tremendous effects. Well, we don't really want to tell people that until the end, because we don't want to bias how they're perceiving their own patients during the course of the clinical trial. So usually we don't tell them until the end.
So
That's layer number one.
that mean they're going to receive a report at the very end to say that if this clinical trial is a success, just some lay terms?
Yes, exactly. And at the end, and this has been a big effort in the industry as well, is the idea of making sure that a report of those outcomes is made available to the patients who participated, to the doctors and the patients who participated in the industry as well. So I mentioned that was a multi-layered problem. The other problem is that sometimes we're not good at getting the word out to all of the staff about how things are going, even from a perspective of, like, is it recruiting well? Is it not? Is the trial not recruiting? Are we seeing enough patients? Do we need to find more patients? So sometimes the clinic themselves may not know. Sometimes it's intentional that we don't want to influence them, but sometimes it's just because of communication that could be better. But at the end of the trial, the results should be sent back. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about the end of the trial is that once the trial is all done and all of the data is collected, all of that data needs to be analyzed, needs to be, we need to do our data entry. We need to collect all of the data from all of the labs and all of the x-rays and all of those things. And then we need to put it into a database and run the analysis. And that can take several months. And if you're in a clinical trial that recruited its first patient 3 years ago and its last patient 1 year ago, and now it's going to be several months before the results from that last patient get added onto the pile, it could sometimes be many, many months or even years between your agreeing to participate in a clinical trial and that final result to be available. It's a very long process, which is one of the reasons that we so appreciated when patients decide to, give of themselves and to contribute to the clinical trial process. Because if they didn't, then new drugs wouldn't get developed. We wouldn't have the information we need to make new treatments available for patients today and in the future.
Thank you, Todd. Another person wanted to know, can participants get compensated for, like, gas if they had to stay at a hotel, or if their caregiver had to take a day off to, once a week or once a month to drive them to the clinical trials? but their employer says, that's fine, I can give you time off, but I can't be paying you.
Yeah.
So would the clinical trial consider those expenses?
Usually the answer is yes, and more the answer is yes, where sponsors are not only allowed, but even encouraged to compensate patients for. There's a big but coming, but the sponsors are encouraged to sort of reimburse patients for their out-of-pocket expenses, and that's the but, is that what we don't want to be doing is we don't want to be incentivizing in patients to participate in clinical trials so that we're influencing patients that wouldn't have participated anyways. And the only reason you participated is so you can get your check at the end of the day. We want to really make sure that we keep the reimbursement to a very reasonable level, that really is a reimbursement, to make sure that you're not out of pocket for participating. But definitely that is a very normal way for us to operate, is that we make sure that patients are reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses, whether that's for taxi and transportation, sometimes meals and hotel stays, or if you happen to be lucky enough to live in a major center, then maybe it's the $40 a day for parking in the hospital garage or what have you.
Okay. Well, Todd, you had mentioned early on in your presentation that clinical trial folks really appreciate patients who volunteer and participate, because it's really for the greater good of everyone, and it helps to have new medicine come on board. But someone wanted to know, is like, why would I want to help pharma to make money? Because at the end of the day, pharma's going to make money off of me participating in a clinical trial.
Yeah, and I definitely understand that concern, because you're looking at these big pharmaceutical companies that are making billions of dollars, and you're going, well, why would I help them out? Well, I would sort of shift the framing of that a little bit and think less around how you're helping pharma, and think more about how you might be helping other patients who have the same problem that you do. So yeah, the pharma company ends up being the middleman who will benefit. The pharma company and their shareholders will benefit if their treatment is successful. But at the same time, you're going to be helping to contribute to medical knowledge, and you'll be helping make new treatments available to patients. It would be, while I totally understand that concern, and I empathize with that concern, I also think I'm glad that everybody doesn't think that way, because there wouldn't be sort of the next patients to participate in clinical trials as well. And it's only because of their participation that we collect all of this information, and that we can develop new medications that are both effective and safe and make a big difference for patients. And yeah, I mean, so many of the revolutions that we've seen in medicine have been because of the clinical trials, and every single one of them has had to be, for the reasons I showed you early in the presentation, every single one of them has had to go through this process. And it's been, it's thanks to the generous spirit and the willingness to participate of all of the patients that have gone before, that we're medical science as advanced as it is. So totally understand the concern, empathize with the concern, but I would reframe it a little bit and think more about the benefits to society and your fellow patients than, worrying about the fact that pharma company might make some money along the way.
Thank you, Todd. I was going to let everybody know in the audience that we only have a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, please put them in. Otherwise, this will be the final question. Someone wanted to know, if I participate in a clinical trial and it works for me, do I get to stay on the drug?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it's something that we've been working on a lot during the past couple of decades, actually. So I really want to give you a firm yes to to that answer. However, there are a couple of buts. So wherever possible, there is sort of this principle that says a patient who's benefiting from a treatment, they really should be able to continue getting that treatment over the long run. And that's one of those sort of ethical principles, the good clinical practice principles that we spoke to. So usually the answer to that is yes. Where I'm going to, qualify it a little bit is to say sometimes we do a clinical trial and at the end of the day, we find out, you know what, the side effect profile of that medication just doesn't justify the benefit that we saw. And we may say, well, yeah, and quite often in those situations, we'll have individual doctors or patients that say, but I'm sure it was working for me. Like, I feel good on this medication. How can you tell me it doesn't work? Well, this is one of those like treatment effect versus control effect and things like that, and being able to say, like, was the benefit we saw in everybody that participated in the clinical trial, was it enough in excess of the risks that we saw to be able to justify making it available to everybody? So sometimes, even though an individual patient may have had a good experience, at the end of the day, the data says, no, the risk benefit profile for this product wasn't good enough. So we may stop the development of that drug. And those situations are the most frustrating ones, where we know there are patients who may be benefiting, but because we've stopped it. Now, that doesn't mean that every negative clinical trial, we always cut off the supply. In many cases, we'll still continue the supply, sometimes for years, and sometimes for the rest of the patient's lives. But occasionally, the decision is made that we're going to, discontinue altogether. So there's a couple of different scenarios. I guess to summarize, the answer is usually yes. Usually, yes, the expectation is that there'll be a provision made for you to continue getting the treatment. But there are times in which that can be a little bit less certain because of other circumstances that are observed in the course of the whole clinical trial or the development of that product.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that you can always come to the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation website, cpff.ca, and all of our webinars on there, any information, you could just search, and then you can reach out to us if you can't find something. But if you go to our website, www.cpff.ca, you'll find all this information, including today's presentation by Todd Georgieff. So thank you very much, Todd. I know that I can say that I've learned a lot, and it's sort of demystified what clinical trials about, because I always thought, wow, gee, what is clinical trials? How do you get on? And how does one qualify for it? So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, everybody, for your attention today, and I'm glad you were here.